So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for checking in on a wintry day in October, a little sooner than any of us probably wanted to see this, but there you go. If you have a snowmobile or snowshoes, you'll be loving it. So I'm Tim Shiell. I'm the director of the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation. I'm also a professor of philosophy here at UW-Stout, and I'll be your host today. I'm just going to go through a couple of introductory items, and then we'll get to our two presenters. They'll each have 15 to 20 minutes each, so about 5:15, we should be wrapping up and ready to go to your questions and comments. We've been having some issues with the chat function, so if your chat is working, you are welcome to use that. If your chat is not working, then please use the raise your hand option when we get to that point. Everybody should know that this is being recorded. We'll be uploading it to our website later in the week, in the next day or two. Audience members, please keep your mics muted until we get to the Q&A portion and you're speaking. We have one more Free Speech Week event coming up tomorrow night. That also is a Teams event and will be 4:30 to 5:30. That one's on cancel culture and will feature a New York City writer, J.C. Holman, and UW-Oshkosh English professor, Duke Pesta. So I'll introduce our two speakers and we'll get underway. Our first speaker will be Brian Huffman. He's a professor of management at UW-River Falls. I should tell you a little bit about how he ended up here with us today. He actually submitted a paper to our Civil Liberties Symposium that would have occurred last spring, but with the pandemic cancellations, that went away. And so I invited Brian to talk about his paper, not present the paper, but talk about the ideas in his paper for this event during Free Speech Week. And I invited John K. Wilson because he's one of the leading national commentators on academic freedom issues. Brian will kick us off today. I'll just mention one more thing about John. John spent last year at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. That's kind of a big deal. And I'm not sure he'll be talking a lot about the project he did there that had to do more with free press for students. But there may be some connections to our academic freedom topics today. I should also mention John was on a panel last year with us for Free Speech Week when we talked about academic freedom in the case of John McAdams, the Marquette University professor who was fired from his job, but reinstated in a case that went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So welcome, Brian, welcome, John, and Brian can kick us off here.
Okay, good. Tim, as I said, I'm not entirely sure how to open the share tray and stuff, but I'll go ahead and yeah, there we go. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Okay, so, okay, so this is my topic then, academic freedom and freedom of speech, and I kind of wanted to see where they intersect, and I think this research actually changed my own opinion on the subject, so I'll let you know about that when I get to it. First of all, as far as there's some obvious differences between the two, I think. Freedom of speech has got just one guarantor, that's the U.S. Constitution, and then there'd be just one source of interpretation, then the Supreme Court. Whereas with academic freedom, there's no guarantor, and there's many interpreters and many interpretations. So as to what it means, it's open for debate. Academic freedom is a fuzzy concept. One of the things is to the extent that it's like freedom of speech, even freedom of speech varies as you go from the workplace being versus being out in public. One of the things that whole episode with Colin Kaepernick and taking the knee, this was never mentioned in the press, and it was never mentioned by people that were for or against him taking the knee. But that was the fact that he was doing it is at his place of employment. So he's wearing a San Francisco 49ers uniform, and also the whole presentation is under the control of the NFL. And yet, I thought that both the 49ers and the NFL managed to kind of weasel the way out of it and say, well, this is a free speech issue. Well, it wasn't a free speech issue. And they could have said whatever they wanted. They could have endorsed it, or on the other hand, they could have said, you know, he's not doing what we want him to do. So anyway, that's just kind of I thought kind of an interesting aspect of that. I see a difference between the professor's role as educator and researcher, and you'll see that in just a second also. A third group that we talk, or second group we talk about when we talk about freedom of academic freedom, is students. So I want to take a look at the professor as educator, the professor as researcher, and then the student, and see what I can say about each of them in term. Just a quick history, and now that I know I've got 15 minutes, I'm going to blow through this rather quickly. The concept of academic freedom goes back to Europe in the 16th century, comes to the United States at universities like Yale that started out as schools of divinity. And when they were schools of divinity, then they're teaching a particular dogma. And as a result, the professors knew what they had to teach. And then later on, when they added other majors, it became impossible for the administration to guide them. So they had to guide themselves. And of course, they were afraid that they might say something that that their bosses didn't like. So what they did was they came up with this concept of tenure, meaning the administration can't second guess what you say once you've achieved that status. So that kind of protects the professor from the university. Peer review more or less protects the university from the professor. If what you're publishing isn't good enough for your peers, then it's not good enough for the university. Sweezy versus New Hampshire, Keeshan, and California versus Bakke all have to do with freedom of speech, the First Amendment, but they do mention academic freedom in these cases. The first one, Sweezy, had to do with a Marxist professor who was ordered by the state of New Hampshire Attorney General to testify as to what he taught in class. He wouldn't do it, so he was convicted on that basis. Later on, it was overturned by the Supreme Court in this decision. The Supreme Court saying that academics can say what they want in the context of their classes. So it was a free speech issue, but it was also academic freedom. This Keeshan versus Board of Regents had to do with New York State requiring loyalty oaths. They didn't want to hire subversives, and so professors were compelled to sign these loyalty oaths before they were being hired. And that was overturned. California versus Bakke. Bakke had applied to the UC Berkeley Med School and was refused admission when lesser students or lesser qualified students got in. It was a reverse discrimination case. The Supreme Court ruled in California's favor. They said that the ability to decide what sort of students you want, to have diversity, if you like, is a special concern of the First Amendment, that academic freedom falls under the First Amendment. That said, none of these decisions were really based on academic freedom. The courts hadn't really ruled on it. They're talking more about freedom of speech than academic freedom. The University of Missouri fired a professor. Initially, she was, I believe, a journalist or an English professor who had teaching rights in the journalism department. She voluntarily stepped back from that, but later was fired by the university. And I've got this video, and I'm not sure that it's going to work here unless I select something else. I'm going to stop this sharing, and I'm going to open the share tray again. Okay, so I'm just going to do the whole desktop if I can. Desktop, here we go. Okay, so here's the video just real quick for those of you that haven't seen it. Whoops, not this one. Okay. Here we go. This just runs a few seconds.
Hi, Mayday. Can I talk to you?
No, you need to get out. You need to get out.
No, I don't.
You need to get out.
I actually don't.
All right. Hey, who wants to help me get this reporter out of here? I need some muscle over here.
So anyway, she calls for muscle, and that didn't go real big. Essex County, there was a professor fired from that position who had supported a Black Lives Matter event for Memorial Day in New York City, where only Black people were invited. So you couldn't come if you weren't Black. University of California now has kind of come back and on these oaths, and they require new hires to sign an oath in support of diversity. So there are movements in both directions, I guess, for and against free speech. Two views that I wanted to contrast here as far as the professor's role in education were Whittington's views and Buckley. Whittington didn't make any distinction between academic freedom in the professor's role as researcher and teacher. I'm kind of going to go along with Buckley on this one, where I see them as different. So he said, essentially, if you're imparting values, you're indoctrinating students, that it's a violation of free speech, and that it's problematic in that you have to decide whose values you want to put across. My response to that kind of comes from the movie Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where Joan Crawford is pretty mean to her sister who's in a wheelchair, and her sister says, you know, you wouldn't be so mean to me if I wasn't in this chair. And Blanche says, the sister says, but you are Blanche, you are in that chair. And it's kind of, Whittington is saying it would be nice not to impart values, to have this value-free education. And Buckley says, no, you're going to be imparting values. It's just a question of which ones. So that the professor should not have the same academic freedom in research and teaching. That teaching should be less free, that you're going to be imparting values, and it's desirable to impart values, it's ethical, and it's unavoidable. And I'll get to those arguments in just a second. He also said the values that he'd like to see imparted were Christianity and individualism. Now we get to Whittington's comments on that. He says, you know, you might not like the values that are being imposed, that Buckley would like to see Christianity and individualism, but somebody like Herbert Marcuse, for instance, would like to see a different value imposed. He said that true tolerance at the university must be partisan, intolerant towards the protagonists of the repressive status quo. In other words, I want values in education, but I want values that are diametrically opposed to those that are out in society, and that students are so brainwashed by society that they have to be kind of beaten down first in order to be able to be educated. Karl Popper said much the same thing, that we should claim in the name of tolerance the right to not tolerate the intolerant. So this is kind of an invitation for the heckler's veto or disinviting people to campus. Buckley's comments are these. He says, first of all, a value-free education is not desirable. And he uses kind of a funny example where he uses Joyce Kilmer, Alfred Joyce Kilmer, the poet, as an example. I guess Yale considered him to be a pretty lousy poet. Apparently the Columbia University thinks the same way. And Buckley said you wouldn't hire a Kilmer enthusiast to teach poetry, because either you'd have to get that person to teach against his or her will, the way you wanted poetry taught, or the other professors who are trying to teach poetry would be stuck having to undo the damage done by the Kilmer enthusiast. One thing I came across was this society at Columbia University where they think Kilmer's a pretty lousy poet too, and they have a contest every year for the worst poem you can possibly make. And here's an example of one. I'm not going to get into it, but it's pretty cute. He said, Buckley also said it's not ethical to try to have a value-free education. He said if you're out there as a professor and you're reading and you're doing research and whatnot, you come up with what you think is the nearest value to the truth. He said nearest value to the truth instead of the truth as sort of a way to anticipate the relativists' counter argument that, oh, how do you know what truth is? He said, look, maybe you don't know what truth is, and maybe you do make mistakes, but when you come close to it, that's what you ought to teach. Also, he says it's not possible. The truth is not going to come out from a student debate. And his examples, he uses Russia. The Russians went from one totalitarian government to another because they never understood the truth of democracy. Germany, after World War II, the occupation force required sort of an anti-Nazi curriculum to get the youth of Germany back into the real world. There was a very cute movie came out recently called Jojo Rabbit, where this young Nazi is trying to come to grips with Judaism and what it is, and it kind of shows the impossibility of the truth coming out, or how difficult it would be for students to hit on the truth without some guidance. Another example of that sort of thing is you can imagine physics students hitting on the truth of E equals MC squared. It's just not going to happen. You can't teach that truth any other way than just to say, here it is, folks. And what Buckley was saying is, do we want critical thinkers? In other words, we want to have some basis from which critical thinking can be done, or do we want the students just arguing with each other in sort of a nonsensical, opinion-based argument? Do we want to create sophists and relativists, or do we want to create critical thinkers? And his opinion was, you can't create critical thinkers without some basis. And he offered Christianity and individualism as that basis, but a basis would have to be there, he thinks. And he also said it will be there regardless of whether or not you put it there. So he said it's hypocritical to pretend that people have no values and that they're going to teach as if they didn't. Bloom said much the same thing in The Closing of the American Mind, only instead of individualism and Christianity as the base, he thought that a great books program would get students to the point where they could learn. Both of them, though, sort of subscribe to this belief that you don't want to give college degrees to people that aren't ready to think critically. You don't want to give college degrees to people that haven't been educated. And again, this is kind of a Far Side joke here of never giving a gun to ducks. Don't give college degrees to ducks. There's always people that think, well, you can leave your biases behind, and journalists are pretty famous for this belief that you can leave your biases at the doorstep and you can report in an unbiased manner. There's tons of psychological studies that show that isn't possible, that bias is part of our nature, that we're hardwired for it. One of the examples that I think is fairly compelling is this one. Most of the people that are listening in are professors, and they know about the scientific method and everything. And you can ask somebody, for instance, what's this sequence of numbers? And they're perfectly free to offer the next number in the sequence if that'll help them figure out what the sequence is. And most people, I think, if they look at this sequence, are going to say, well, look, how about 7? Could 7 be the next number in this sequence? And I'd say, yeah, it could be. How about 11? Could that be the next number after that? And I'd say, yeah, fine. How about 13? Yep. How about 17? Fine. Are you willing to tell me what the sequence is now? And most people at that point would say prime numbers. The problem is all they've been guessing is prime numbers. And the actual sequence is real numbers in increasing order. So if they had guessed after 5.5, I would have said yes. And if they had guessed, -3, I would have said no. But in any case, once you have a theory in mind, you attempt to confirm it rather than disconfirm it. So the next number that you're suggesting is 7, as opposed to something other than a prime number. Given my time constraint, I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to cut it, it's extremely short. I'll give you a couple minutes of it. But this is what a common ground looked like back in the day. This was a television show that was on in the 1960s. It was a General Electric College Bowl. And what they did was they had students, 4 students from each university battling in a sort of battle of brains. And the questions in this clip, and I'm just going to show you a couple of them, have to do with a very broad range of topics. Right now, a lot of liberal arts professors sort of flatter themselves that they teach critical thinking, but their students are every bit as specialized as students in the sciences or engineering or whatever. Every bit is limited. I've talked to a lot of students in liberal arts and just really basic mathematics, basic science. They really just don't get everything 101 as opposed to something like the Great Books program behind them. But here's just a little bit of that. And I'll just skip over this very quickly. This was the intro to the show. And we're talking about what's the Battle of the Brains. Let me go to a couple questions.
Reared head of a horse.
Who painted this?
Chagall. And who painted these racing horses in a picture of jockeys in the rain? Monet? No, it was Degas.
I got one
Man
wrong.
was a late Ice Age man. His people were the first known artists and created famous cave paintings.
Cro-Magnon.
Cro-Magnon, yeah. If I said Goneril and Cordelia, you'd have to say Regan to complete the famous trio of sisters. For 10 points, what would you say if I said Peep Bo and Pitty Sing? The answer...
Princeton, Chernikov.
Yum Yum. Yum Yum is the answer. You get 5 points for each of the following melodies you can remember and sing, hum, or whistle. First, the national anthem that identifies the defeated army in Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. On this basis.
Deposits are carried by rivers and moraines by glaciers.
Yes, that's right. 20 points. The song in 1916.
The tank.
Yes, the tank, that's right. What weapon was skillfully wielded by Jesse's son in a famous military encounter that took place in the Valley of Elah?
The sling.
Yes, the sling. Recapitulation, that's right, for 20 points. Now you're playing for 20.
Oh.
The second is the development. For 20 points, name the third.
Recapitulation.
Yes, recapitulation, that's right.
Anyway, you get the idea. Moving on. My point for academic freedom with respect to education is I kind of agree with Buckley on this one, where I really don't think you can educate in a value-free environment, and we aren't actually educating in a value-free environment. Moving on to research, can you have academic freedom in research? In this case, I'm going to be a little more positive. I think you can. This obviously shows you what happens to most researchers over the course of their career. One of the questions I'm required to ask an interviewee at River Falls is, what role do you envision for yourself in promoting the appreciation of individual differences in a rich cultural history? Here's an unacceptable answer for you. I'm from China. I actually had a Chinese applicant who didn't know what I was talking about. A worse answer would be, I teach calculus. There's no possibility that I can do what you're talking about. The modern university has been described as a great diversity of like minds, and that we all are sort of on the same page. There really isn't any differences, and that's going to create a certain amount of parochialism in a hiring and subsequent research. Anyway, this was something that was written very, very recently about Macalester College, a fairly prestigious institution in the Twin Cities, $70,000 a year, essentially. Catherine Kirsten described the reality of the place. They think of themselves as tolerant and looking for intellectual breadth and depth. And she said really the reality is it's a cardboard cutout world of hackneyed, ideologically charged platitudes, tolerance being in fairly short supply. I'm recommending that people not play a beer game with any of these words. They are overused, to say the least. on college campuses. The left-leaning bent of college professors is not just the stuff of myth. These charts here represent self-identification, and when you start at about 1994 and go to the present, this blue line goes up quite a bit. Professors self-identifying as liberal, and then you go far left, and the same pattern repeats again about 1995. It takes off. Now these are the people that are doing the hiring and promoting, and as a result, you're going to get a certain amount of like thinking. You also get some intellectual fakery. The new topic there is being called opinion laundering, where you have an opinion or a feeling, you establish a journal on point, you publish in the journal, and now you've turned that opinion into knowledge. Just as money laundering turns dirty money into clean money, you change somebody's thinking, their opinion into legitimate knowledge of the scholar. This again, another real quick one here. These three authors published under their left-leaning professors, and they really are all very much in favor of gender studies and whatnot. But they were concerned that not one, but several of the top journals were getting a little bit loose in their scholarship. So they published under a fake name a article called Dog Park, and Dog Park was about how society sort of promotes the raping of dogs in these dog parks. Anyway, this is just where this guy announces that that very prestigious journalist has accepted the publication.
I have now closely considered the revisions of your manuscript, Dog Park, and will recommend its publication in Gender, Place, and Culture. You have done very good work to address the issues the reviewers raised and have clarified your arguments. Thank you for your contribution to Gender, Place, and Culture, and I hope to be seeing your manuscript in print. Yours truly, PhD, Managing Editor, Gender, Place, and Culture. We have an accepted paper in the #1 feminist geography journal.
Since approximately June of 2017, I, along with two other concerned academics, Peter Bogosian and Helen Pluckrose, have been writing intentionally broken academic papers and submitting them to highly respected journals in fields that study gender, race, sexuality, and similar topics. We did this to expose a political corruption that's taken hold of the university. By this point, several of these papers have been accepted in highly respected journals, and one that claims that dog humping incidents can be taken as evidence of rape culture has been officially honored as excellent scholarship. I'm not going to lie to you, we had a lot of fun with this project.
The reviewers are worried that we didn't respect the dog's privacy. That's the concern.
Anyway, you get the idea. Actually, these people gave me some hope for research. I was kind of thinking that academic freedom was maybe not such a great idea in research, but these sort of self-policing people would tend to make research stay legitimate. So the peer review process, for instance. And the other thing that's going to tend to make research stay legit is the fact that there are so many journals that you can publish in. So if you can't get published in the one, you can get published in the other. The authors themselves were talking about their future, and they said they think that it's pretty grim, but maybe not. We'll see. So just to conclude the second part of my looks, in the first part, professors in education, I really don't think academic freedom is a good idea there. Here in research, it seems like it probably is. It probably should be the same thing as freedom of speech. Then we move on to the students and what they would like to see as freedom of speech. And you've got some sort of right-wing organizations, Student for Academic Freedom and FIRE.
Brian, sorry to interrupt, but it is 5 o'clock now, so can you?
Oh, did I go? I went that long. Okay, I'm sorry. I actually had planned this for longer, and yeah, I'll just show you real quickly what the students are looking for, and I just say it's unrealistic. You know, they're just saying, you know, we want to be graded based on what we have to say, and we want to be we want to have all different opinions brought to campus and everything. I just really don't think that's very realistic. And then they want to be able to have, trigger warnings and that kind of thing. I'm going to skip through this then. So the conclusions essentially just what I was kind of mentioning there, that academic freedom seems like it's probably a good idea in research, maybe not so much in teaching. And as far as students are concerned, I really don't think that they should be given the academic freedom that they're looking for. First of all, I think it's impossible. And if the students desire to be graded objectively by unbiased faculty, they're not living in the real world. Also, just my own personal opinion is that the student is the product, not the customer. If the student were the customer, we would give them all A's because that's what they're looking for. And that's not what we do. So sorry about that. And now back to you guys. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. John, you ready?
Yes. Thank you for that, Brian. I don't have PowerPoints, but on the bright side, you don't get to watch ancient game shows that make you feel stupid. So you have that advantage. I certainly agree with Brian, with William F. Buckley. There's no such thing as value-free education, but it is a question of power, of who is going to be in charge of having these values, who gets to decide what gets taught in the classroom. And to a great extent, I think what the idea of academic freedom is that we need to rely on professors. And of course, William F. Buckley was completely opposed to academic freedom. He did not trust the professors. He did not want to have intellectual freedom in the classroom. What he wanted was to have an orthodoxy imposed by the university, a conservative orthodoxy. And for that reason, we have with an idea of academic freedom, I think, is the idea of protecting professors from that kind of orthodoxy and from that kind of imposition of politics. Of course, William Buckley was writing during McCarthyism, celebrating in some sense the idea of McCarthyism. Now, I think free speech is a fairly well-established principle. We know who it applies to. It's a universal right, and we have many legal cases that outline it. Academic freedom, I would argue, is less well-defined. When we talk about academic freedom, who has academic freedom? What does it mean? Who gets to decide? These are sort of the disputed and debated questions. And I want to focus on two general different approaches to thinking about academic freedom. One, which I call the expertise model, which is sort of the conventional wisdom that pervades universities now, says that academic freedom and free speech are very different concepts. And academic freedom is based on the expertise of professors and applies only to them. The other model, what I want to advocate, is what I call the liberty model, is the idea that academic freedom is deeply interconnected with freedom of speech, and that academic freedom is something that applies throughout the university to everyone. Now, the expertise model of academic freedom is, there's a lot of people who advocate it. One of the best is Joan Wallach Scott in her book, Knowledge, Power, and Academic Freedom. And she writes, quote, "Free inquiry is essential to its definition, but it is inquiry patrolled and legitimated by disciplinary authority." As she puts it, quote, "Academic freedom insists upon the expertise of scholars," end quote. So professors have academic freedom because they are experts. This freedom is regulated by other professors who are experts. And academic freedom is by the experts, for the experts, and limited to matters of their expertise. On the other side, what I want to argue for, which is far to the left of where we are now in some ways, but also far from where William F. Buckley would be, is the idea of academic freedom, this liberty model, the idea that academic freedom is intertwined with free speech. And academic freedom is really the application of free speech principles to the academic context. And I think a very good definition of this was given by David Kaye, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, who issued a report earlier this year on academic freedom. And here's how the UN, through David Kaye, defined academic freedom. Quote, "Academic freedom should be understood to include the freedom of individuals as members of academic communities, faculty, students, staff, scholars, administrators, and community participants, or in their own pursuits, to conduct activities involving the discovery and transmission of information and ideas, and to do so with the full protection of human rights law. So according to this UN model, the scope of the meaning of academic freedom is very broad. It's the discovery and transmission of information and ideas. It's not limited just to academic work, it's even in people's own pursuits. And a very wide scope of people are covered by this vision of academic freedom. It's not just the tenured professors, it includes students, staff, even the community. So it's not based on academic expertise. So the question we have with the expertise model is the idea that professors have academic freedom because they are academic experts, and they need this freedom to do good work in their research and teaching. And the liberty model says that freedom is a fundamental value of a college, and it should permeate every aspect of an educational institution. So the goal of the expertise model is to build an ivory tower and to create special privileges that protect the professors from the hordes of barbarians outside the gates who threaten to censor academic work. And the goal of the liberty model that I'm advocating is that we create a shining example of academic freedom in higher education that protects everyone. And people see this freedom and seek to extend and expand freedom of expression in the rest of society. Now, I want to turn to understand the differences between these models and why I think this model is important. I want to turn to the origins of academic freedom in America. And in 1915, when the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, is founded, it issued a declaration of principles that defined academic freedom to cover three things: research, teaching, and extramural utterances. You already heard about the first two, about research and teaching, from Brian. And you probably understand what they are. But what are extramural utterances? And in Latin, extramural means outside the walls. It means speech outside of your academic work. And so extramural utterances is really a fancy term for your dumb opinions about anything. And professors in their research and teaching are hired for their expertise, and they have to follow some professional norms. But professors also speak outside of class and express opinions beyond their narrow academic specialty. That's what extramural utterances are, and they're protected because they're so essential to the academic freedom of professors. And the expertise model, in my view, can't really explain why professors should get these special privileges protecting their extramural utterances, because after all, those are outside of their expert knowledge. But the idea of a university as having this fundamental academic freedom that applies to everyone is part of the reason why we protect extramural utterances. And the protection of extramural utterances is particularly important because it has been by far the most common source of threats to academic freedom in the past century. Professors are almost never punished for their views in their research, and only occasionally for their teaching. Overwhelmingly, it is their extramural utterances, when they tweet something offensive, when they give a speech, or make a public statement that offends somebody. This is what provokes public outrage and creates the efforts to punish faculty. So from a practical perspective, I think we need a broader theory of academic freedom that can defend extramural utterances. It's important to note that in 1915, when the AAUP was founded, neither academic freedom nor free speech had any enforceable meaning. There were no Supreme Court rulings striking down laws abridging free speech. There was no ACLU or other major organizations for First Amendment rights. So the AAUP, at a time without legal protections for free speech, was trying to establish free speech for a limited category, the professors. And that's the idea behind academic freedom. And it was a radical notion in 1915. And the AAUP certainly could not have ever gotten public support for this broader approach to academic freedom that I'm advocating. But it's really important that by establishing this idea of academic freedom, the AAUP really helped create and improve the climate for free speech in general. Because when colleges protected academic freedom for professors, they showed the value of free speech for intellectual life. And they helped, in some ways, create the idea of free speech as a cultural norm in our society. And academic freedom and free speech are deeply intertwined ideals in many ways. When free speech falters, academic freedom falters as well. So you see in 1917, the United States enters World War I, and it begins a period of massive repression, both in our society and on university campuses. And the same happens as well during McCarthyism. So I think what we need to do is have this broader concept of academic freedom because it is so essential to the work of a university. And I think some people may find this a ridiculous concept. For example, you may wonder, should academic freedom really apply to the janitors who work at a university? Obviously, the work of janitors is not academic work, even though it may be essential for a college, especially now. But janitors need to have academic freedom because it is a fundamental value of the whole institution. If a college decides that janitors are banned from criticizing the US president on their own time, it has a chilling effect on the entire campus. And even tenured professors will be wary of speaking out if a janitor is fired for saying the wrong thing. So in many ways, I'm arguing that for academic freedom, we all have to stand together, students, faculty, staff, that our freedoms are all interconnected. There's actually an example of academic freedom for janitors that occurred in 2016 at Yale University, where a janitor named Corey Menafee was offended by a stained glass window that depicted scenes from slavery. And so he took a broomstick and intentionally broke the window. And as a condition of dropping criminal charges and keeping his job, Yale banned this janitor from discussing why he broke the window. Now, academic freedom is not an absolute right to do anything you want. Colleges can control what people do in their professional work and even fire them for doing it badly, such as a glass smashing janitor. But they should not control their ideas and their expression. Colleges can regulate and should regulate the destruction of art, but not art criticism. Now, this liberty model obviously creates lots of conflicts. If everybody has academic freedom, what do you do when there are conflicts between them? And consider the idea of student academic freedom, which Brian mentioned earlier in his talk briefly. If students have academic freedom, for example, why are all of you muted right now? Why can't everybody in a class or a lecture say whatever they want, whenever they want, for as long as they want, on any subject they want to? And the reason, of course, is that chaos would be the consequence of that. And the purpose of a college course is not to maximize the amount of yelling, but have a structured conversation for an educational purpose. And to do that, we give professors, the experts on the subject matter, the authority to set the syllabus and to control the classroom conversation. Students do have academic freedom outside of the classroom in many ways, as well as the academic freedom within the classroom to be judged on their academic work rather than their political opinions. But it is not the same kind of academic freedom that professors have. Brian mentioned Students for Academic Freedom, which is a group that was created by David Horowitz, a right-wing activist, many years ago. And Horowitz created this because he thought that students had the academic freedom, and student academic freedom meant the right not to have a professor discussing politics in a class that's not about politics. And to me, this is an example of someone manipulating the term academic freedom in order to repress it. Horowitz didn't want students to actually have the freedom to express themselves. He wanted to use the idea of student academic freedom as a way to crush the academic freedom of faculty, much like William F. Buckley wanted many, many decades ago. So in talking about these ideas and these different ideas about academic freedom, I want to give you a chance to ask some questions and we can have a discussion. So I'm going to cut short a lot of what I have to say and we can talk about it in the questions. But I want to emphasize that we need academic freedom in this broad sense. And some people might say, why do you need it if we have freedom of speech already? Well, freedom of speech is a very limited idea. There are, in particular, private colleges that aren't covered under the First Amendment, who are covered by the idea of academic freedom. But there are many ways in which freedom of speech is sharply curtailed in the typical workplace. If you think you have the freedom of speech to denounce your boss, to embarrass your employer with controversial political views, you might find yourself unemployed like Colin Kaepernick. But academic freedom protects these things. And so the idea is that a university should be different. It should be better than the larger society. And maybe one day we'll have a society that protects Colin Kaepernick and protects the rights of workers in a much better way. But it's particularly essential to have academic freedom for everyone because of the work of a university, because of the importance of the exchange of ideas and the free flow of ideas that must come about. So what I want to argue for is this broader conception of academic freedom as a way of working for the transformation of rights for everyone in a free society, of promoting free speech in the larger society. And in conclusion, I think we should defend academic freedom not as a special right for a privileged elite of tenured professors, but because it is deeply connected to advancing the fundamental rights of free speech for everyone. So with that, we welcome your questions and your interrogations of what we had to say.
Thanks, John. Be on the lookout for questions as they pop. I'm going to toss one out to you both to start with. You both have mentioned the academic freedom as a right of faculty or instructors and students. I've also run across academic freedom as a right of the institution itself, which may trump the rights of faculty members and students. And I've also seen academic freedom discussed as a right of a department or a discipline, an academic discipline, able to impose restrictions on faculty or students as a department or as a discipline. So I'm wondering how you two think those things might fit into the picture, or if you think they shouldn't be part of the picture, or what your thoughts are on the role of the institution in a department or discipline.
Well, I'm someone who really hates the concept of institutional academic freedom. And it's something that was basically created in the courts. It wasn't created by the AUP or other advocates of academic freedom. The idea behind it was basically to, sometimes it can be useful. There are some ways in which there should be judges deferring to the authority, the judgment of academics, and not trying to micromanage universities. But there's a real danger when universities use this as a way to attack academic freedom for students or for faculty. That an institution will say, well, we have the academic freedom to fire any faculty member we want for any reason, or to suspend a student and violate their due process rights. And so I think it's very important to recognize that academic freedom should be an individual right. It's the right of different individuals to express themselves. And the right of collective institutions, of administrators or disciplines, they have the right to express themselves, to critique people, to, in some cases, enforce professional norms when those are violated, but they don't have the right to silence faculty and students. I think you're muted, Tim.
Oh, sorry. I was going to tell Brian he was muted and I was muted myself. Sorry, everybody. Brian, your thoughts on that one?
Okay, I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think if we're disagreeing at any one point, it probably has to do with education, so as opposed to research or anything else. And the problem that I think that Buckley had with a value-free education was that let's say each professor is going to teach his or her values, then what you've got is many architects instead of one vision, and the result, he thinks, and I tend to agree, doesn't really amount to an education, because you're getting French 101, Spanish 101, Italian 101. Now you can't speak any language because you haven't gone in depth anywhere. You don't have the background, and that the discussion that happens in the class is really babbling. One of the things I mentioned in my paper was I had a friend who was a priest who went to this sort of extremely prestigious university in Rome. Their graduates include a number of popes and everything. And anyway, to get everybody on the same page, and mind you, they're all priests, they're all pretty much on the same page already. The lectures for the first 2 years were in a common language, Latin or Italian, and that's it. And then there was this common curriculum. And he raised his hand to ask a question during his first year, and was told by the professor in no uncertain terms that he didn't know enough to ask a question to be worth hearing. And so come back to me with that question in 2 years and we'll chat. So anyway, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not finding a lot to disagree with, but that issue of the Buckley's point was that there will be values taught, you know, and maybe that gets to the university's academic rights. Values will be taught. Now, are you going to allow a smorgasbord which won't provide the depth for critical thinking, or are you going to have an architectural vision? And be honest about it. One of the other things Berkeley was commenting on was it was just hypocritical to say that you know, this is a value-free environment and laissez-faire education, to each his own kind of thing. And I know professors on my own campus where you don't disagree with them, and if you do, you're done.
I'm not seeing other hands go up, so I'm going to jump in with another question.
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Tim.
Actually, I'm sorry. It's not a question. It's a statement. Professor Wilson, I think your concept of the liberty concept of academic freedom misses the point that with rights come responsibilities, and the janitor has no responsibility like a professor would have to have proved him or herself over a 7-year period at least in their expertise to doing their research or their teaching. You gain academic freedom by proving you are knowledgeable and professional. To extend academic freedom to everyone on campus, you know, begs that, you know, that there is no responsibility to become an expert in the area that you are claiming to be free to express yourself in. But I do want to say that I agree with your concept of students as having academic freedom that's different than professors, and that's because students have academic freedom as inquirers. They have not proven their expertise, but they have proven their interest in inquiring, and those they should be able, under the concepts of academic freedom, to ask any questions they want and pursue those questions within a reasonable parameters, which is where the academic freedom of the professor to say, okay, we're done, we're not pursuing that in my class anymore because it's not a productive direction, clashes with theirs, and the professor in that case should actually trump the student. So your reaction to that would be appreciated.
Well, I think the issue of rights and responsibilities, I actually disagree with you. I don't think responsibilities come with rights. I don't believe rights are contingent upon having responsibilities, and that's certainly true with freedom of speech. You have a right to freedom of speech. You don't have a responsibility to speak well or to be a nice person when you speak. There are responsibilities that professors have. They have responsibilities to teach, to respect the rights of students, to engage in honest and truthful research and good research, and we hire people based on their quality of work, their academic work. But their rights are not dependent on those things. They still have the right to speech, to extramural utterances, for example, regardless of whether they're engaged in fulfilling their responsibilities. They can be fired if they fail to show up to class, but because they would not fulfill their responsibilities as a professor, but they can't be fired for expressing an offensive opinion. They have no responsibility. They have rights without responsibilities to express what they wish.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I agree with the concept of you know, that rights are, you know, God-given. They're there, and there's no getting away from that. And that's why I think freedom of speech is a little bit different from academic freedom. I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting, if you look at the more right-wing student organizations, if you look at Students for Academic Freedom and you look at FIRE on, say, maybe the right side, and then you look at Antifa and whatever on the left side, they're both calling for the same thing in the end. It's my right to not hear what I disagree with, and that's why, you know, I think you got to be careful about student freedom of speech, because I know that the Georgetown law students, a case in point, when they shut down a speech by, I think it was the Secretary of Homeland Security, well, they shut it down. So obviously they're stopping speech. There's no, you know, way you can sugarcoat that. They went on to say that this university is ours. Georgetown University belongs to the students. They also went on to say that we will respond to these things in our manner, regardless of whether or not it complies with the administration. And oh, by the way, no punishment should be exacted for doing the opposite of what a university is supposed to be doing. And the ironic thing was, of course, they cast their position as freedom of speech. So it was the freedom of speech is the freedom to prevent speech. And again, both sides are guilty of that. Both left and right are guilty as far as students are concerned. And like the questioner said, professors are held to a bit of a higher standard, that we're not just babbling. And certainly we're not shutting down other people's speech.
Tim, I'd like to respond to Professor Huffman.
Sure, we got time.
Okay, thank you. Professor, I appreciate your partial support. That's very kind of you. But I do want to feel that you've mischaracterized the FIRE organization. I don't know the student organization you mentioned, but I'm very familiar with FIRE, and I don't believe that FIRE would like it to trammel on anybody's ability to say what they think on campus. In fact, Greg Likianoff, the head of FIRE, is a noted liberal, and I think that their position has always been pretty much, may not like what you say, but I'll defend it to the death. Your right to say it. So I think your characterization, at least of that organization, as one who would shut off speech for people on whatever the other side is incorrect.
Yeah, I agree. I think I miscast FIRE. The SAF was more along those lines. But one thing that I think FIRE calls for, which I'm not opposed to, I just think it's unrealistic, and that's the insistence on being graded fairly by people that don't agree with you. And I will tell you, if you look at the like for instance the impeachment thing, the Democrats were pretty happy with the Democrats' argument. The Republicans were pretty happy with the Republicans' argument. Both sides would have characterized the other side's arguments as ridiculous. So if I'm a professor and a student comes up to me with a paper that's, let's say, objectively brilliant, am I actually going to be able to get outside of my bias and grade it correctly? And FIRE does call for that sort of thing. And I think it's like saying, we can create heaven on earth, and we really can't. And it's okay to call for it, but I think it's kind of silly to believe it'll ever happen.
I would disagree. I think it's very important to call for it and to demand it, and to provide mechanisms for students to appeal grades when they are unfairly graded based on their political views rather than their academic work. And so I think that's an important part of student academic freedom, that they have that right. Now, professors are going to have very broad discretion to grade the academic work within their expertise, and students don't have the right to silence their professors or to prevent them from expressing their biases and all of that. But they do have the right to expect fair grading. Completely unbiased grading may be difficult, but I think an enormous number of professors bend over backwards to give better grades to students who disagree with them. And I, it doesn't always happen. You can't always be sure of it, but it's something we really need to encourage professors to believe in and advocate, and for students to be willing to disagree with their professors. And the idea of academic freedom is, professors get to run their classrooms, and there is broad discretion within that we don't want to have the William F. Buckleys of the world dictating everything. But we do want to advocate for professors to treat their students fairly, regardless of their political views.
I'm just going to jump in quick and say we hit the 5:30 mark. We're into overtime. I'll ask the indulgence of Brian and John if they would stick around for a few more minutes to end the conversation for those interested. But if you have other things to do, shovel your driveway or dig your car out of the snowbank or something, feel free to take off. We'll hang on here for a couple more minutes. I wanted to throw out a specific, or this is a real life example. My first year out of grad school teaching, I was in a philosophy department teaching ethics classes, and some students came to me a couple weeks into the semester and were having trouble with one of their other ethics professors. And they said, well, he comes in and declares he's a utilitarian, buys into that particular ethical view. And basically, the class is just trying to indoctrinate us into being utilitarians. And any argument against that gets graded badly. So our choice is mimic his views and get good grades, or criticize his views and suffer the perils of a bad grade. Where does that fit into people's picture of the academic rights of faculty and students, I wonder?
Well, it's a difficult case. Professors can require students to understand material. He can require students to know what utilitarianism is and explain it, and he can overemphasize and excessively discuss utilitarianism to the deficit of other kinds of theories. That's all within sort of the purview of academic freedom within the classroom. He certainly shouldn't be punishing people for not agreeing with his views on utilitarianism or requiring them to support utilitarianism. That, I think, goes too far. What kind of action you take about that, whether it can be proven in terms of a grade review, whether you might critique him in an evaluation and that sort of thing, I think that is legitimate, that professors have the right to express their views and to focus the classrooms and their classes in certain ways. In some ways, some people might call that indoctrination, but they don't have the right to impose those views and require people to agree with them.
I think one of the problems I still have kind of with the argument is that I really think that professor could be completely honest with himself and grade those papers that oppose his position poorly. It's here's an example, and everybody's going to think I'm a horrible Philistine for saying this, but I've heard people talk about Marx's relentless logic, in other words, brilliant logic and everything. And when I read that stuff, to me, it's just gobbledygook. I would give him an F. It's like this is never going to work in reality, and you are missing all these points: motivation of workers, but again, if I was completely honest and I read it, I'd say F. Sorry, Although I'll tell you one thing too, just to be honest, the fact that it's long, I would tend to give it a higher grade. So I'd say probably a B+, because I know the student worked hard. I think it's nonsense, but I know they must have worked hard. Spent a lot of time in the library in London,
Okay, any other last questions for our two wonderful speakers today, or are we ready to call it a night? Going once, going twice. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. Have a safe trip home.
Yeah. Thanks to John, too, and yourself, Tim. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Great event. Thanks, John and Brian. Have a nice night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.